that birth to like that window, that rapid firing of those neurons and those brain cells. And so when we say environment matters, when we say what's going on in the environment matters, it really does. So we're very much needed. But yet and still the child care field in itself does not get the recognition that's honestly deserving.
Welcome to Waging Love, a podcast exploring early care and education, told through conversation, grounded in research. What you hear here is not opinion. It is record, data, history, lived experience studied, documented, and repeated across generations. These stories are not exceptions. They are patterns. I'm Tim Harper, and this is Waging Love.
Money and caring. I chose caring a long time ago.
Episode 1, Name the System. A patchwork that families can't afford, providers can't sustain, and educators are expected to hold together through love and sacrifice. Episode 2 returned to the people who have carried that system and told the truth about how it was built. Indigenous care was removed. Black care was extracted. Latina care was governed through precarity. Asian and Pacific Islander care was governed through invisibility. Immigrant care was governed through legal vulnerability. White women were positioned as buffers and stabilizers. And men, especially white men, remained closest to power while staying distant from daily care. So the question that remains is not whether we have enough evidence. We do. The question is why the evidence doesn't automatically become accountability. Why does a system we all describe as essential remain underfunded? Why do reforms keep returning and keep falling short? Why do the same expectations of sacrifice reproduce themselves even after we name them? Here is the provocation for episode 3. A system can be essential and still be organized to exploit. And the reason it keeps functioning is not that people don't see what's happening. It's that the system has learned how to make exploitation feel normal. This episode is about that learning. It is about how history becomes structure, how structure becomes culture, how culture becomes expectation, and how expectation becomes something people begin to enforce, even on themselves. Once we understand that, we stop asking, why doesn't the system change? And we start asking the real question. Who benefits from it staying the same? And who pays the cost? That is where we begin.
They do it because it's so very important. And it's like, even though I'm not being heard, I still need to ensure that this little life is getting what it needs from me. From everything that I am, I'm giving to this little one, and I will still continue. It's wow.
The function, the very serious function of racism, is distraction. Toni Morrison. Early care and education in the United States did not emerge as a neutral public good. It emerged over time through a series of historical decisions made across specific eras, each one shaping how care would be valued, who would provide it, and what protections, if any, would exist. From the beginning of the United States, care was treated as something that could be demanded without being fully paid for, especially when it was performed by women who were already positioned outside political and economic power. During slavery, from the 17th century through 1865, enslaved black women were forced to care for white children while being systematically denied the ability to care for their own families. This was not incidental. It was foundational to both the plantation economy and the social order. Enslaved black women's caregiving labor allowed white households to function, while slavery simultaneously stripped black families of legal recognition and protection. Care during this period was extracted under violence, surveillance, and threat. It was never recognized as skilled labor. It was treated as something black women were naturally expected to provide, regardless of cost. When slavery formally ended in 1865, this structure did not disappear. It adapted. During Reconstruction and into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Black women were funneled into domestic and caregiving roles through labor arrangements that preserved control while removing legal ownership. Domestic service became one of the most common forms of employment available to Black women, particularly in the South, but increasingly nationwide. These jobs were poorly paid, largely unregulated, and excluded from emerging labor protections. By the early 20th century, as labor laws began to take shape, domestic and caregiving work was intentionally excluded from many protections. When the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938, establishing minimum wage and overtime protections, domestic workers and agricultural workers, jobs disproportionately held by Black and immigrant women, were excluded. This exclusion was a political compromise designed to preserve racial labor hierarchies. At the same time, white women were being positioned differently within the caregiving economy. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as industrialization accelerated and public schooling expanded, white women increasingly entered teaching and caregiving roles framed as moral and civic service. By the Progressive Era, roughly the 1890s through the 1920s, white women were widely described as natural caregivers, uniquely suited to nurture and educate children. This framing offered respectability and trust, but it also justified low wages. Teaching and caregiving were framed as callings rather than professions. White women were trusted with care, but their labor was not treated as skilled or deserving of full compensation. This distinction is critical. Black women were paid poorly for care, but denied authority. White women were trusted with care, but denied fair wages. Together, these positions helped establish early care and education as feminized, racialized, and economically undervalued work, without ever naming that structure explicitly.
Yeah, my mom and my dad were educators. Actually, in our nuclear, the grandparents, you were either an educator or you were a farmer. You know, there wasn't anything in between. So I come from a family of educators and or farmers, or both, because grandmama was a farmer. You know, after hours and an educator. Again, she started the very first Head Start class in Cades, South Carolina, which is in between Kingstree and Lake City in South Carolina. So I was in her class. I do remember being there. I can't remember day to day, but I know I was there. But I was always with her, so it wasn't like I was in school, you know, because I was just with my grandma. My grandma Jessie was the best thing ever created by God.
Indigenous caregiving systems tell a parallel but distinct story, with their own timelines. Long before the United States existed, Indigenous communities across North America practiced care and education through deeply relational, land-based systems. Children were raised collectively, learning through observation, participation, and relationship, rather than through separation into formal institutions. Beginning in the late 19th century, particularly after the establishment of federal Indian boarding schools in the 1870s and 1880s, Indigenous caregiving and educational systems were actively targeted for destruction. Boarding schools were designed not to support Indigenous children, but to assimilate them, often forcibly, into Western norms, languages, and values. These policies criminalized Indigenous caregiving practices and treated Indigenous women's knowledge as backward or dangerous. Children were removed from their families. Care was severed from land, language, and community. This history matters because it explains why Indigenous educators today are often invited to contribute culture symbolically, through land acknowledgements or cultural activities, while being excluded from shaping systems of authority, curriculum design, or governance. The extraction of Indigenous knowledge without recognition of Indigenous sovereignty is not a new phenomenon. It is the continuation of policies established over a century ago.
A boy was torturing me about, being Indian and all this kind of stuff, whatever. White kid. Anyway, I finally got tired of it and I turned around and I told him, I said, I really don't appreciate you making fun of me being Native and everything else. I said, you know who the most prejudiced people are? They're Native Americans, because it's people like you that put us down as being First Nations on this land. You shouldn't even be here. And it shut him up. He didn't say anything else after that. And when I got to high school, he was one of my good friends because I had said that to him. And it never didn't dawn on him, but that's how he was taught.
Immigration policy added another layer to the architecture of care, particularly during periods of rapid industrialization. Between the late 19th century and the mid-20th century, as the U.S. economy shifted and white women increasingly entered factory, clerical, and later professional work, immigrant women were relied upon to fill caregiving and domestic roles. Women from Asia, Latin America, and later the Caribbean and Africa entered care work through immigration systems that were explicitly racialized. Exclusionary immigration laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and later national origin quotas, created conditions where immigrant labor was both desired and tightly controlled. For those allowed to enter, legal precarity, language barriers, and limited labor protections made caregiving work one of the few viable employment options. By the mid to late 20th century, care work had become a common entry point into the U.S. labor market for immigrant women, particularly in urban centers. Yet these jobs remained largely unregulated, underpaid, and excluded from collective bargaining rights. What ties all of these histories together is not just who did care work, but how care work was defined at each stage. Care was framed as moral duty rather than skilled labor, as love rather than expertise, as natural rather than learned. Because it was framed this way, it was repeatedly excluded from full labor protections, by design, not oversight. This historical architecture explains why early care and education today is characterized by low wages, high turnover, and chronic instability. It explains why the field depends on the endurance of workers who have fewer alternatives, and it explains why moral narratives about love and sacrifice remain so powerful. When we look at early care and education today, its demographics, its wages, its fragility, we are not looking at a system that failed to value care. We are looking at a system that was built, across centuries, not to value it. Low wages were not a failure of the system. They were part of the architecture. And once we understand that, the workforce demographics we explored in Episode 2 stop feeling mysterious. They stop looking like coincidence. They begin to look like consequence. That history is not behind us. It is present, and it continues to shape who does this work, how it is treated, and what the system expects people to endure. Before we talk about hegemony, before we talk about how power becomes normal, we need to talk about something that often gets treated like a neutral fact: demographics. Because in early care and education, demographics are not just who shows up in the workforce. Demographics are where the system places risk. Demographics are how the system builds stability without calling it governance. And if Episode 2 was a tour through the women who have carried this system, then this section is the map that explains why that tour looks the way it does. The estimated early educator workforce size, about 1.78 million people. In that estimate, the workforce is about 55.6% white, approximately 988,000 educators, about 21.4% Latina, approximately 380,000 educators, about 14.8% Black, approximately 264,000 educators, about 4.4% Asian, approximately 78,000 educators, about 0.4% American Indian or Alaska Native, approximately 7,500 educators, about 3.0% multiracial, approximately 54,000 educators. And those numbers come with a warning. Pacific Islander educators are often erased through data aggregation, and Indigenous educators are routinely undercounted because tribal and community-based systems are not consistently captured in national datasets. Those numbers are not random. They reflect what we established in Episode 1. a system that was built to rely on care while refusing to pay for it. And they reflect what we established in episode 2, a system that distributed harm unevenly, removing some people from care, extracting care from others, governing some through precarity, and buffering others through protection. Demographics are the residue of that history. Here's another data point that makes the architecture even clearer. Immigrants make up at least 1 in 5 early childhood educators nationwide, about 20 to 21%, which translates to roughly 500,000 people, depending on the workforce definition used. That share is even higher in major care markets like New York and Florida, where immigrants comprise roughly 40% of early educators. And in many regions, immigrant women are disproportionately represented in home-based care, family child care homes, and informal networks, which are both essential and systematically undervalued. Again, this is not because immigrants are naturally suited to care. It is because care work is one of the sectors where legal precarity can be absorbed without structural reform. So if we treat demographics as just representation, we miss what matters. Demographics are an index of the system's labor strategy. They show us who the system expects to endure low wages, who it expects to take on emotional labor, who it expects to translate across language and culture, who it expects to absorb instability without voice, and who is most likely to be believed, promoted, or protected when conflict arises. And that sets up the question that frustrates almost everyone who enters this field with good intentions. If the harm is so visible, in history and in data, why does it keep reproducing? Why do the same patterns return decade after decade, even when we name them? To answer that, we need to talk about how power becomes common sense. Race neutrality, it turns out, is a deadly force. Ruha Benjamin. When we talk about the demographics of early care and education today, they are often presented as neutral facts. We hear that the workforce is overwhelmingly women. We hear that women of color are disproportionately represented. We hear that many educators are immigrants, that many are multilingual, and that the field includes a wide range of roles, from classroom teachers and assistants to home-based providers and administrators. But demographics are not neutral. They are not simply who happens to be present in a field. They are the cumulative outcome of history, policy, and power. Demographics tell us where labor has been directed, where opportunity has been restricted, and where vulnerability has been allowed to persist. If Section 1 explained how early care and education was built, this section explains who that design relies on today. By the early 20th century, care work had already been shaped into a low-wage, feminized, and weakly protected sector. When the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938, domestic and caregiving work was explicitly excluded from minimum wage and overtime protections. Once a labor sector is built outside full protections, it becomes a magnet for workers with fewer alternatives. Over time, that magnet effect shapes demographics. As immigration patterns shifted after the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 eliminated national origin quotas, immigrant women increasingly entered care work. By the late 20th century, early care and education had become a field heavily reliant on immigrant women and women of color, not by accident, but by design. This is where demographics tell us more than representation. They tell us who absorbs instability. Underpayment does not land evenly across the workforce. When funding is unstable, the system does not collapse immediately. Instead, the cost is distributed downward. It is absorbed by those who are least able to refuse it. Women of color are overrepresented in the lowest paid roles. Immigrant educators are more likely to work in positions without benefits, predictable schedules, or job security. This is not incidental. It is how the system maintains itself under scarcity. This pattern is not about individual intent. It is about how credibility is assigned. Demographics shape not only who is present, but whose voice carries weight. They shape whose complaints trigger reform, and whose complaints trigger discipline. They tell us who the system relies on. They tell us who the system protects. And they tell us who the system expects to endure. And that prepares us for the next section, how power turns history and demographics into common sense. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. Bell hooks. At this point in the episode, we've done two things. We've traced the historical architecture of early care and education, and we've looked at the demographic reality of the workforce today. What remains is the most frustrating question of all. If these patterns are so clear, and if the harm is so widely acknowledged, why do they keep repeating? Why does early care and education remain underpaid even when it is universally described as essential? Why do reforms so often feel incremental or symbolic? And why do expectations of sacrifice, gratitude, and endurance continue to feel normal rather than political? To answer that, we need to talk about how power becomes common sense. This is where the concept of hegemony is essential. Hegemony describes a form of power that does not rely primarily on force or explicit exclusion. Instead, it works by shaping norms, expectations, and assumptions over time, so that certain arrangements feel inevitable, reasonable, or simply the way things are. Under hegemony, people do not need to be constantly coerced. They learn to self-regulate. In early care and education, this process did not happen all at once. It developed gradually across the 20th century, alongside the expansion of public schooling, the feminization of teaching, and the exclusion of care work from labor protections. By the early to mid-20th century, roughly the 1920s through the 1950s, care work had become firmly associated with women's moral responsibility rather than professional labor. Teaching young children, caring for infants, and supporting families were framed as extensions of women's natural roles, rather than as skilled work requiring public investment. This framing mattered. When work is described as moral rather than technical, it becomes difficult to argue that it deserves high wages, benefits, or institutional power. The idea that you don't do this work for the money did not emerge accidentally. It emerged alongside the systematic exclusion of care workers from labor law protections and from collective bargaining rights. By the post-World War II period, as the U.S. economy expanded and the middle class grew, this moral framing became deeply normalized. Many professions saw rising wages, benefits, and professional status. Care work did not. Instead, care workers were praised for their dedication and thanked for their sacrifice. This is normalization at work. Normalization is the process by which conditions that should provoke outrage instead become background expectations. It is how low wages come to be seen as unfortunate but inevitable. It is how understaffing becomes a permanent feature rather than a crisis. It is how burnout becomes an individual issue rather than a structural outcome. Normalization is reinforced every time scarcity is treated as a fact of nature rather than a political choice. In the 1960s and 1970s, as social movements pushed for civil rights, women's rights, and labor protections, early care and education was increasingly recognized as important, but it was still not fully integrated into the welfare state. Programs expanded unevenly. Funding remained unstable. Responsibility was shifted between families, providers, and local systems, rather than being claimed collectively. By the 1980s and 1990s, as neoliberal policy frameworks gained dominance, public investment in social services was increasingly framed as inefficient or unsustainable. Market logic entered early care and education more explicitly. Programs were expected to operate like small businesses, even as their workforce was underpaid and their margins were thin. This shift intensified hegemony. When care programs are framed as businesses, but care workers are framed as moral actors, the system creates an impossible contradiction. Educators are expected to provide high-quality care with limited resources, to absorb instability without complaint, and to adapt endlessly to new demands. Hegemony works here by narrowing what feels possible. If funding is framed as permanently limited, then demands for structural investment feel unrealistic. If care is framed as love, then demands for compensation feel inappropriate. Over time, these assumptions shape not just policy, but identity. Educators begin to ask less. Providers begin to expect instability. Burnout becomes normalized rather than interrogated. This is not because people do not know better. It is because the cost of resisting normalized expectations is unevenly distributed. Hegemony does not operate the same way for everyone. It intersects with race, citizenship, and institutional positioning to produce different pressures. For some educators, normalization teaches that gratitude is required. For others, it teaches that silence is safer. These are not personality traits. They are learned strategies for surviving in a system that assigns credibility and risk unevenly. Hegemony also shapes reform conversations. When early care and education is framed primarily as a workforce issue, reforms may focus on training, credentials, or professional standards. When it is framed as an economic issue, reforms may focus on market efficiency or parental choice. What often remains missing is a recognition that the field's instability is not incidental, and that asking educators to adapt again and again is part of how the system maintains itself. This is why reforms that seem sensible on paper often feel inadequate in practice. They operate within the boundaries of what hegemony allows us to imagine. Hegemony does not mean people agree with the system. It means they learn how to live within it. And that learning is structured by history and demographics. When we look back at the historical exclusion of care work from labor protections, and when we look at the demographic concentration of marginalized workers in the field today, hegemony helps us understand why these realities continue to reproduce themselves without constant enforcement. The system depends on adaptation. It depends on educators who care deeply and keep going anyway. It depends on providers who absorb instability for the sake of families. It depends on a workforce trained to normalize conditions that should be unacceptable. Understanding hegemony does not solve the problem, but it clarifies why naming harm alone is not enough. It explains why awareness does not automatically lead to change, and it prepares us to take the next step. Because once we understand how power becomes normal, we can begin to see how it operates differently for different people. That is where
even teach you in high school that if you have a child, how to properly take care of them. Do you know how many doctors' children that I have kept, and they bring them to me on the weekend? They might be a heart surgeon, but they don't know how to use the aspirator to clean stuff out of their nose or to get it off their chest so their child don't have pneumonia. You can go to school and be taught specific things and miss a whole part of life. And then people expect you just to know it. How do you know it? You don't know it if nobody teaches you.
If we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. Kimberlé Crenshaw. Up to this point, we have traced how early care and education was historically constructed, how its workforce demographics came to look the way they do, and how power becomes normalized through culture and expectation. What we have not yet done is examine how the same system produces different rules for different people. This is where intersectionality becomes essential. Intersectionality is not a checklist of identities, and it is not a way of ranking suffering. It is a method for understanding how systems distribute risk, protection, credibility, and punishment across different positions. It allows us to see how history, demographics, and hegemony intersect in lived experience. In early care and education, intersectionality reveals something fundamental. Belonging is often conditional. People are included in the workforce, but the terms of inclusion vary. Those terms are shaped by race, gender, immigration status, and historical positioning within the system. These conditions did not emerge overnight. They were built over time, layered onto the historical architecture we discussed earlier, and reinforced through the normalization processes described in the last section. For many Asian and Pacific Islander educators, conditional belonging often operates through proximity without authority. This dynamic has roots in the mid-20th century, particularly during the Cold War period of the 1950s and 1960s, when Asian Americans were increasingly framed as evidence that the United States was a meritocratic society. The so-called model minority narrative emerged during this era not to empower Asian Americans, but to stabilize racial hierarchy by rewarding compliance and quiet assimilation. In early care and education today, that legacy can show up in subtle but persistent ways. Asian and Pacific Islander educators may be relied upon for consistency, reliability, and emotional restraint. Cultural stereotypes about harmony and respect for authority can be institutionally rewarded, but they can also be used to extract labor without granting influence. Safety is often offered conditionally. As long as resistance remains muted and conflict is avoided, belonging is maintained. Leadership, however, remains elusive. Silence may be interpreted as agreement. Indirect communication may be interpreted as consent. When harm is experienced, it can remain unaddressed because the institution assumes harmony rather than recognizing self-suppression. Intersectionality helps us name what is happening here. This is not privilege. It is containment. The system takes labor and stability while withholding authority and protection. For Latina educators and providers, conditional belonging often operates through gratitude and the policing of presence. To understand this dynamic, we need to recognize that Latina communities are not monolithic and that their histories in this country differ significantly. Many Latina educators are indigenous to this land, with ancestral ties that predate the borders and institutions that now govern early care and education. Others are immigrants, whose legal and social belonging has been shaped by immigration policies, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, including intensified enforcement regimes in the 1990s and post-9/11 era. And many are both. Yet institutional narratives often collapse these distinct realities into a single message: be grateful to be here. For indigenous Latina educators, this message functions as erasure. It treats belonging as conditional rather than inherent, ignoring sovereignty that existed long before the modern state. For immigrant Latina educators, the same message functions as threat. Legal precarity, shifting immigration policies, and social hostility shape what can be said, what can be asked for, and how visible someone can afford to be. In early care and education, relational warmth and family-centered practices are often celebrated, until they become political. When Latina educators name structural needs such as wages, benefits, language access, or time, the institutional response can shift. Warmth is reframed as over-familiarity. Advocacy is reframed as entitlement. Boundaries are reframed as attitude. Intersectionality allows us to see that this is not about individual demeanor. It is about belonging being used as leverage. Gratitude becomes a requirement. Silence becomes a survival strategy. For Black women educators, conditional belonging is often enforced through surveillance and discipline. This dynamic cannot be separated from the long history of Black women's labor in the United States, from slavery through domestic service and into contemporary caregiving roles. From the late 19th century onward, Black women's care labor was extracted under close monitoring. Their bodies, speech, and behavior were regulated in ways that white women's were not. That historical pattern did not disappear with the passage of civil rights legislation. It adapted. In early care and education today, this legacy can show up in the policing of tone, the narrowing of what counts as professionalism, and the speed with which Black women's leadership is framed as aggression or insubordination. Advocacy that would be praised in others can be labeled threatening. Emotional expression can be interpreted as instability rather than evidence of harm. Intersectionality helps us name this without euphemism. Black women are often disciplined not only for what they do, but for what they represent in systems still shaped by the afterlife of slavery. The risk attached to visibility is higher, and the margin for error is smaller. For Indigenous women educators, conditional belonging often collapses into inclusion without sovereignty. Indigenous caregiving and educational systems were actively dismantled through assimilation policies beginning in the late 19th century, and those dynamics continue to shape institutional relationships today. Indigenous educators may be invited to share culture, language, or land acknowledgements, particularly in the wake of increased public attention to Indigenous history in the 2010s and beyond. But those invitations rarely extend to decision-making power, curriculum authority, or governance. When Indigenous knowledge can be translated into dominant frameworks, learning outcomes, standards, documentation, it may be welcomed. When it insists on relational, land-based epistemologies that challenge institutional norms, it can be dismissed as informal or unacademic. Intersectionality helps us see the extraction at work. The system will take indigenous culture as enrichment, while refusing indigenous sovereignty as authority. Presence is tolerated. Power is not shared. To understand how the system stabilizes itself, we also have to talk about white women, not as individuals, but as a structural group. White women make up roughly 50 to 60% of the early care and education workforce. That scale matters. It means white women's experiences are not peripheral. They are central to how the field defines itself and imagines reform. White women in early care and education experience exploitation. Intersectionality does not deny that, but exploitation is mediated by race. Historically, white women were positioned as morally legitimate caregivers, trusted, protected, and seen as appropriate authorities even within patriarchal systems. That legacy continues today. Because of racial trust and institutional familiarity, white women are more likely to be believed when harm is named, more likely to be promoted into leadership, and more likely to be protected during conflict. This creates a form of relative safety that does not eliminate exploitation, but buffers its consequences. This buffering produces a structural bargain. Alignment with existing power structures offers relative security in an otherwise unstable field. In a system where many educators face higher risks for dissent, that relative security can shape how strongly people are willing, or able, to push for structural change. Intersectionality helps us understand why solidarity often fractures when gender is separated from race. It is not because individuals lack ethics. It is because systems reward proximity to whiteness and punish collective disruption. Across all of these positions, the conditions differ, but the function is the same. The system distributes risk unevenly in order to maintain stability. Conditional belonging is not a failure of inclusion. It is a feature of how power operates. Once we see this clearly, we stop asking why individuals adapt and start asking why the system depends on adaptation. We stop treating silence as apathy and start hearing it as strategy. We stop mistaking confidence for safety and start listening for constraint. This is the analytic bridge between history, demographics, and lived experience. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde. Here's what we know so far. First, early care and education was historically constructed as low-wage, feminized, and weakly protected labor. Second, the demographics of the workforce today reflect that history, concentrating risk among women of color, immigrant women, and indigenous women, while buffering others through institutional trust. Third, hegemony helps explain why these conditions feel normal rather than political. With that context, we can ask, if we know all of this, why do reforms so often fail? The answer is not that reformers don't care. The answer is that many reforms are built on assumptions that do not match the structure of the system. As a result, reforms frequently stabilize the very dynamics they claim to change. Most reforms in early care and education focus on a single lever: wages, credentials, access, quality standards. Each of these matters. But when reforms isolate one lever without accounting for history, demographics, and uneven risk, they tend to redistribute burden rather than power. Let's start with wages. Raising wages is necessary. No serious analysis disputes that. But wages alone do not determine stability. When wage increases are not paired with benefits such as healthcare, paid leave, retirement, and predictable schedules, the most precarious educators remain exposed. In some cases, modest wage increases can even increase instability by pushing workers just above eligibility thresholds for public assistance without replacing those supports. This matters because the workforce is not positioned evenly. A wage increase lands very differently for someone with family wealth than for someone supporting extended family. It lands differently for someone with stable housing than for someone navigating rising rents. It lands differently for a citizen with healthcare access than for an immigrant navigating care without insurance. When reforms assume a neutral worker, they privilege those already closest to safety. Credentialing is another common reform strategy. Credentials are often framed as professionalization, and professionalization is framed as respect. But credential requirements assume time, money, language access, and institutional navigation skills. They assume that educators can afford unpaid coursework, unpaid practicum hours, and ongoing training. They assume that life outside work is flexible enough to accommodate these demands. For many educators, particularly women of color and immigrants, these assumptions do not hold. When credentials become gateways to higher pay or leadership without structural support, the system rewards those who already have access while excluding those who carry the heaviest caregiving and economic burdens. The reform appears merit-based. The outcome is predictable. Professional development follows a similar pattern. Training is often presented as an unquestioned good, but when professional development is unpaid or underpaid, it becomes a form of extraction. It asks educators, already underpaid, to donate more labor in the name of quality improvement. And because educators are positioned differently, the cost is uneven. Some can attend easily. Others cannot without losing income, arranging childcare, or risking job security. When reforms ignore that uneven cost, they deepen inequity while claiming progress. Leadership pipelines are frequently proposed as solutions to representation gaps. They are framed as empowerment. But leadership pipelines do not operate in a vacuum. They operate inside systems that already assign credibility unevenly. If white women are more likely to be perceived as professional, articulate, and promotable, and if women of color are more likely to be surveilled, disciplined, or labeled difficult, then leadership initiatives can simply accelerate those already closest to authority. The pipeline fills, but the structure remains intact. This is not because leadership development is inherently flawed. It is because leadership development without racial analysis reproduces hierarchy. Quality rating and improvement systems provide another example. Quality frameworks are often designed around indicators that require resources, staff stability, documentation systems, materials, and time. Programs serving marginalized communities, often staffed by the most precarious educators, are least likely to meet these standards, not because they provide lower quality care, but because they operate under tighter constraints. When these programs are labeled low quality, responsibility is shifted away from structural inequity and on to individual providers. Quality becomes a measure of compliance rather than a reflection of conditions. The system names outcomes without naming causes. Across all of these examples, the pattern is consistent. Reforms that assume a neutral worker, equal risk, and uniform access to resources will produce unequal outcomes. This is why equity language alone is not enough. A system can adopt the language of equity while maintaining the structure of extraction. In care work, extraction often wears the mask of improvement. More training, more standards, more accountability, without redistribution of power or resources. History matters here. Early care and education was built on the idea that care should be provided without full compensation and without collective responsibility. Demographics show us who has been expected to absorb that cost. When reforms ignore that history and those demographics, they treat symptoms rather than causes. This is also why reforms often feel exhausting to the workforce. Educators are asked to adapt again, to train again, to credential again, to comply again. And all of it happens without fundamental shifts in stability, compensation, or authority. Over time, this creates reform fatigue, not because educators are resistant to change, but because they are asked to carry change without relief. A reform is not successful because it improves averages. It is successful when it changes conditions for those most impacted by harm. Intersectionality forces us to evaluate reforms by that standard. It asks who benefits first, who benefits last, who bears risk during transition, and who is expected to endure in the meantime. If a reform requires the most marginalized educators to absorb the greatest uncertainty, then it is not transformative. It is extractive. And this brings us directly to the interviews that follow. The people you will hear next are not responding to abstract reforms. They are responding to lived consequences, policies layered on top of histories they did not choose, and expectations shaped by positions they did not design. Understanding why reforms fail is not about assigning blame. It is about recognizing patterns so we stop repeating them. By now, the through line of this episode should be clear. Early care and education did not arrive at its current state by accident. The history of the field shaped how care was valued, how it was compensated, and how responsibility for it was distributed. That valuation shaped who entered the workforce and who remained. The demographics of the workforce today reflect those decisions, concentrating burden among people who have historically had the fewest alternatives and the least protection. Hegemony explains why these conditions feel normal rather than political. It explains how expectations of sacrifice, gratitude, and endurance became embedded in the culture of the field, not as temporary compromises, but as enduring norms. Intersectionality explains why those expectations are not enforced evenly, and why belonging in early care and education is often conditional rather than secure. Taken together, these frameworks point to a difficult but necessary conclusion. This system does not rely on ignorance or misunderstanding. It relies on adaptation. It relies on people learning how to survive within constraints they did not design and cannot easily escape. It relies on moral narratives that frame exploitation as virtue. And it relies on demographics that allow instability to be absorbed quietly, without triggering structural change. This is why the next phase of this series matters. The conversations that follow are not meant to resolve these tensions or reconcile them into a single story. They are meant to reveal how these dynamics are lived, negotiated, and sometimes resisted in practice. You will hear people who love their work and feel harmed by it at the same time. You will hear people who believe deeply in reform and feel constrained by the systems they work within. You will hear people who benefit from the current structure and still experience exhaustion, conflict, or doubt. These are not contradictions to be smoothed over. They are evidence. What becomes visible through these interviews is not a collection of individual opinions or personalities. It is a set of recurring patterns shaped by history, demographics, and power working together over time. Some voices will sound confident. Others will sound careful. Some will name harm directly. Others will speak indirectly, pause, or redirect. Those differences are not random, and they are not simply stylistic. They reflect where people are positioned within the system, what protections they have access to, and what risks they carry when they speak. This is where responsibility enters the frame. Not the responsibility to judge individuals, not the responsibility to assign blame or identify villains, but the responsibility to stop accepting explanations that locate failure at the level of personal resilience rather than structural design. For decades, early care and education has been described as a field that is struggling because the work is hard, the margins are thin, or the workforce is uniquely devoted. These explanations sound sympathetic, but they obscure something essential. Early care and education is not unstable because people care too much. It is unstable because it has been organized to rely on underpaid labor, uneven protection, and normalized sacrifice. It is essential not because it is fragile, but because it has been made fragile. It is essential not because people endure, but because people have been expected to endure. The system has depended, quietly and consistently, on that endurance. This episode is the hinge of the series. It takes us from naming what happened to understanding how it keeps happening. It connects the historical architecture of the field to the demographic realities of the workforce, and it shows how power turns those realities into common sense. It also reframes what comes next. The interviews that follow are not meant to provide closure. They are not meant to offer a single solution or a unified perspective. They are meant to make visible how people move through a system that asks them to absorb contradiction, to care deeply while being undervalued, to comply while being surveilled, to advocate while managing risk. What matters is not whether every voice agrees. What matters is what the patterns reveal when those voices are heard together. If we take this episode seriously, then the question that follows is not simply how to improve early care and education, or how to stabilize a broken system. The deeper question is this: what would it mean to transform a field that was never designed to be equitable in the first place? What would it require to shift responsibility away from individual endurance and toward collective accountability? What would it require to value care not as moral sacrifice, but as social infrastructure? And what would it require to redistribute not just resources, but power? Those questions do not have easy answers, but they cannot be avoided. Because as long as early care and education continues to depend on normalized sacrifice, any solution that does not confront that reality will remain partial. What comes next in this series does not attempt to resolve these questions. Instead, it stays with them. It listens to how power is lived, sometimes resisted, sometimes negotiated, sometimes quietly absorbed, by people doing their best inside a system that was never designed to fully support them. And if we can hold that reality without simplifying it, without rushing toward comfort or reassurance, then the conversations that follow can move us closer to accountability rather than explanation. That is where Waging Love goes next.
You know, I'm going to retire May 25th, and I'll probably be back here reading or doing something for free, volunteer, you know, because that's,
and I think it's something that's instilled in us from a child up, and that is, you got to have the love in you, okay, to do this.
Care is not separate from justice. Justice is what love looks like in public. Until care is treated as labor, as leadership, and as power, justice remains unfinished. I'm Tim Harper, and this was Waging Love.
Right. So I think that just fundamentally, to me, the future would just be so simple. It's just a valuing of our natural resources, children and families, and the people who are doing that work, valuing them and compensating them and ensuring that their well-being is intact so they can do the important work of developing and ensuring that we have natural resources for the future.